Imagine a world where the sky was unconquerable, where generals watched helplessly as enemy forces moved unseen beyond the horizon, where the third dimension of warfare remained locked away, waiting for someone brave enough, or perhaps crazy enough, to claim it. On a cold September morning in 1908, at Fort Myer, Virginia, a fragile contraption of wood, wire, and canvas lifted off the ground, carrying with it not just two men, but the future of American military power. This is the story of how the United States Army Signal Corps took a gamble on two bicycle mechanics from Ohio, and in doing so, changed warfare forever. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let me take you back even further. Picture the battlefield of the late 19th century. Communication was everything. Armies lived and died by their ability to send messages, to know where the enemy was, to coordinate movements across vast distances. The Signal Corps wasn't some backwater military unit. No, these were the men who kept armies connected. They used flags, torches, telegraphs, and anything else that could carry information across the chaos of war. They were innovators, always looking for the next technological edge. Now, by the early 1900s, Europe was buzzing with excitement about flying machines. The Wright brothers had made their historic flight at Kitty Hawk in December 1903, and suddenly, what had been the realm of dreamers and lunatics became reality. But here's what most people don't realize. The military establishment wasn't immediately sold on this idea. In fact, many officers thought flying machines were dangerous toys with no practical application. Can you imagine that? The very technology that would dominate 20th century warfare was dismissed as a circus act. But there were visionaries in the Signal Corps. Men who understood that if you could get a man up in the air, above the battlefield, he could see everything. He could spot enemy positions, count their numbers, watch their movements, and report back. This wasn't just about flying. This was about information. And information was the Signal Corps' business. Brigadier General James Allen, the chief signal officer of the Army, was one of these forward thinkers. In 1907, he did something remarkable. He established a specification for a flying machine that the Army might purchase. Let me read you what they asked for. They wanted an aircraft that could carry two people, with a combined weight of 350 pounds. It had to fly for at least 1 hour without landing. It needed to reach speeds of at least 40 miles per hour. It had to be easy enough to learn that an intelligent man could figure it out in a reasonable time. And here's the kicker, it had to be easy to take apart and transport in Army wagons. Oh, and it needed to land without requiring extensive preparation of the landing area. They were essentially asking for a miracle in wood and fabric. The Signal Corps put out this request for proposals, and guess what? They got responses. But most of them were from cranks and dreamers who had big ideas but no actual aircraft. Except for one response. The Wright brothers submitted a bid. Orville and Wilbur Wright, who had been quietly perfecting their flying machine over the previous 4 years, offered to build an aircraft that met all the Army's specifications for $25,000. That's about $850,000 in today's money. The Army accepted. Now, 1908 became the year everything changed. The Wright brothers had been working in relative secrecy, making improvements to their design, learning the science of flight through trial and error. They weren't just mechanics. They were engineers, scientists, and test pilots all rolled into one. And they were meticulous. Every flight was documented. Every modification was carefully considered. They understood that they were doing something no human beings in history had ever done successfully before. Fort Myer, just across the Potomac River from Washington, became the testing ground. Picture this scene with me. It's September 1908. The weather is starting to turn. There's a crispness in the air. Word is spread that the Army is going to test a flying machine, and people are curious. Soldiers, officers, civilians, even members of Congress come out to watch. They set up a small parade ground as the testing area. And there it is. The Wright Flyer. It doesn't look like much, honestly. It's a biplane, meaning it has two wings stacked one above the other, connected by wooden struts and wire. The pilot sits on the lower wing, out in the open air. There's no cockpit, no protection whatsoever. Behind the pilot is a small engine, and behind that, two propellers that spin in opposite directions. Orville Wright was the pilot for these demonstrations. Wilbur was in France, conducting similar demonstrations for European audiences. On September 3, 1908, Orville made his first flight at Fort Myer. The engine sputtered to life, the propellers became a blur, and slowly, impossibly, the machine began to move across the grass. Faster, faster, and then it lifted. The crowd gasped. Think about what they were seeing. For all of human history, people had been earthbound. Sure, they had balloons, but those just drifted with the wind. This was different. This machine was under control. Orville banked left, then right. He flew in a circle around the parade ground. He was up there for 1 minute and 11 seconds on that first flight. Over the next several days, Orville flew again and again. Each flight was longer than the last. He was building confidence, both his own and the Army's. On September 9th, he stayed up for 57 minutes, circling the field again and again. The crowd grew larger with each flight. People were witnessing history, and they knew it. Newspapers sent reporters and photographers. The flying machine was the talk of Washington. Can you imagine the excitement? The sheer wonder of it? But the Army wasn't just interested in a pilot flying solo. Remember, the specification called for carrying a passenger. They wanted an observer who could spot enemy positions. So Orville began taking up passengers. Lieutenant Frank Laum became the first Army officer to fly as a passenger on September 9th. Then Lieutenant Frederick Humphreys went up. Then others. Each flight demonstrated that this wasn't a fluke. This was a reliable machine that could carry 2 men into the sky. Then came September 17th, 1908. This day would become one of the most significant in the history of American military aviation, but not for the reasons anyone hoped. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, a 26-year-old officer who had been working with Alexander Graham Bell's Aerial Experiment Association, was scheduled to fly with Orville. Selfridge was brilliant, enthusiastic, and passionate about aviation. He climbed aboard the flyer, taking his position next to Orville on the lower wing. The engine started. They took off smoothly. Everything seemed normal. They circled the field 3 times. Orville took them up to about 75 feet. And then something went wrong. Witnesses heard a strange tapping sound. One of the propellers had split. The vibration caused a wire to break, and the tail of the aircraft lost its control. The flyer began to shake. Orville fought with the controls, trying to level out, trying to bring it down safely. But it was too late. The aircraft nose-dived into the ground from 75 feet up. The crash was devastating. Both men were pulled from the wreckage. Orville had suffered a fractured left leg, several broken ribs, and hip injuries. But Lieutenant Selfridge had taken the worst of it. He had a fractured skull. He was rushed to the Fort Myer hospital, where Army surgeons operated immediately, but it was no use. Thomas Selfridge died that evening, becoming the first person to die in a powered aircraft crash. The tragedy shook everyone. The demonstrations stopped immediately. Orville was hospitalized for weeks. The public, which had been so enthusiastic about flying, suddenly remembered how dangerous it was. Critics of military aviation seized on the accident as proof that flying machines were too risky, too unreliable for military use. Some called for the entire program to be scrapped. The future of American military aviation hung in the balance. But here's what's remarkable. The Army didn't quit. The Wright brothers didn't quit. After Orville recovered, they analyzed what went wrong. They redesigned the propeller. They strengthened the control wires. They made the aircraft safer. And in June 1909, they came back to Fort Myer to try again. This time, everything had to be perfect. There would be no second chances. The new trials began. Orville, still recovering from his injuries, flew carefully but confidently. The aircraft performed beautifully. On July 27, 1909, Orville took up Lieutenant Benjamin Foulois as a passenger and flew for 1 hour, 12 minutes, and 40 seconds. They covered 40 miles at an average speed of just over 42 miles per hour. The aircraft had met every single one of the Army's specifications. On July 30th, the Army officially accepted the aircraft. They paid the Wright brothers $30,000, $25,000 for the base price, plus a $5,000 bonus for exceeding the speed requirement. The United States Army now owned an airplane, not a prototype, not an experiment, an actual military aircraft. It was designated Signal Corps Aircraft No. 1. Think about that name for a second. Aircraft No. 1. The first of what would eventually become thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of military aircraft. But at that moment, it was just one fragile biplane, stored in a shed at Fort Myer. Now came the question, what do we do with it? The Army assigned Lieutenant Fulwa to figure that out. Fulwa was sent to Fort Sam Houston in Texas with the aircraft and told to learn how to fly it and develop its military applications. Here's the funny part. Fulwa had never actually piloted an aircraft. He'd been a passenger, sure, but he'd never flown one himself. The Wright brothers gave him a few days of instruction, and then he was on his own. Can you imagine? Here's an airplane, kid. Figure it out. Don't crash. And Fulwa did figure it out, though not without some hard landings and close calls. He taught himself to fly through a combination of practice, intuition, and letters back and forth with the Wright brothers. He'd write to them asking technical questions, and they'd write back with advice. It was the world's first correspondence course in aviation. Fulwa flew reconnaissance missions, experimented with aerial observation, and even tried dropping small bombs from the aircraft, though that was unofficial and unauthorized. But one aircraft does not make an air force, and the Army knew it. Over the next few years, they purchased more aircraft. Not just from the Wright brothers, but from other manufacturers who were now entering the field. Glenn Curtiss became the Wrights' main competitor, producing aircraft with different designs. This competition drove innovation. Aircraft became faster, more reliable, more capable. Engines got more powerful. Designs became more sophisticated. The Army also began training more pilots. They established a flying school at College Park, Maryland, in 1911. The school was primitive by any standard. There were no runways, just an open field. No simulators, no extensive classroom training. You learned by watching others, then you got in the aircraft and tried not to kill yourself. It was incredibly dangerous. Crashes were common. Several pilots died during training. But the men who volunteered for this duty were special. They were the best and the brightest, the most adventurous and daring officers the Army had. By 1913, the Army had enough pilots and aircraft to create a real aviation unit. They established the first Aero Squadron. It was tiny, just a handful of aircraft and pilots, but it was a start. They began developing tactics, trying to figure out how aviation fit into military operations. How do you communicate between an aircraft and ground forces? How do you navigate without landmarks when you're up in the clouds? Then came
How do you maintain
aircraft in
1916?
These were all
United
questions
States
without
sent a
answers.
punitive expedition
and the
into
early
Mexico
military
to pursue
aviators
Pancho
had to
Villa,
figure them out through
who had raided the
experience.
town of Columbus, New Mexico.
The first Aero Squadron was attached to the expedition, led by General John Pershing. This was the first time American military aircraft would operate in an actual combat zone. The pilots were excited, eager to prove what aviation could do. But it was a disaster. The aircraft they brought were Curtiss JN-3s, nicknamed Jennies. They were trainers, not combat aircraft. The conditions in Mexico were brutal. The high altitude and hot temperatures meant the engines couldn't generate enough power. The aircraft could barely get off the ground with a pilot and observer aboard. The desert winds were treacherous. Sen got into everything, damaging engines and controls. Several aircraft crashed. Within weeks, the squadron was effectively grounded. The pilots spent more time repairing aircraft than flying them. The Mexico expedition taught the Army a harsh lesson. Having aircraft wasn't enough. You needed the right aircraft for the mission. You needed proper support equipment. You needed spare parts, mechanics who understood the machines, and logistics to keep everything running. The technology was still in its infancy, and there was so much to learn. But learn they did. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, military aviation had advanced tremendously. European nations had been fighting for 3 years, and they'd learned what aircraft could do. Fighters battled for control of the skies. Bombers struck behind enemy lines. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted enemy movements. Aviation had become essential to modern warfare. The American military scrambled to catch up. In 1917, the Army's aviation section, still part of the Signal Corps, had fewer than 250 aircraft, most of them obsolete trainers. They had around 130 pilots. Compare that to France, which had thousands of aircraft and pilots. The United States was hopelessly behind. Congress appropriated $640 million for aviation, a staggering sum, to build up an air force capable of fighting in Europe. Training schools were established across the country. Aircraft factories went into mass production. Thousands of young men volunteered to become pilots. It was a massive mobilization effort. The Signal Corps' little aviation section exploded in size. And here's an interesting point. The rapid expansion created enormous challenges. There weren't enough experienced pilots to train the new ones. There weren't enough aircraft. Accidents multiplied as undertrained pilots flew unreliable aircraft. Hundreds of American pilots died in training accidents during World War I, never even making it to France. But the ones who did make it over distinguished themselves. American pilots flew French and British aircraft initially, since American designs weren't ready yet. They fought in famous units like the Lafayette Escadrille, which had been formed by American volunteers before the U.S. entered the war. Pilots like Eddie Rickenbacker became national heroes, racking up aerial victories against German aircraft. American aviation had proven itself in the crucible of combat. When the war ended in November 1918, the Army had over 11,000 aircraft and more than 10,000 pilots. The Signal Corps' aviation section had grown into a massive organization, and it had become clear that aviation needed to be its own branch, separate from the Signal Corps. In 1918, the aviation section became the Division of Military Aeronautics, and then in 1920, it became the Air Service. It was no longer just about signals and communication. Aviation was about combat, about controlling the skies, about striking the enemy from above. Looking back at those early days, it's amazing to think about how far things came in such a short time. In 1908, the Army had one aircraft that could barely stay in the air for an hour. 10 years later, they had thousands of aircraft, pilots who were combat veterans, and the beginnings of a doctrine for air warfare. That first Wright flyer, Signal Corps Aircraft No. 1, had started something incredible. The men who made this happen were true pioneers. The Wright Brothers, who built the machine. General Allen, who had the vision to pursue it. Lieutenant Selfridge, who gave his life for it. Lieutenant Foulois, who taught himself to fly and became one of the founding fathers of American military aviation. And all the pilots, mechanics, and officers who took this fragile new technology and turned it into a weapon of war. They didn't know they were building what would eventually become the United States Air Force, the most powerful air force in history. They couldn't imagine jet aircraft, supersonic flight, stealth technology, or precision-guided munitions. They were just trying to get a machine made of wood and fabric to stay in the air long enough to be useful. But their work laid the foundation for everything that came after. The birth of American military aviation was messy, dangerous, and uncertain. It was filled with setbacks, tragedies, and doubts. But it was also filled with courage, innovation, and an absolute refusal to give up. Those early aviators knew they were doing something important, something that would change history. And they were right. The sky would never be unconquerable again. America had claimed it, one shaky flight at a time, starting with that cold September morning in 1908 when Orville Wright lifted off the ground at Fort Myer and took the future with him.